Santiago, Chile, 1973. A military coup overthrows the democratically elected socialist government of Salvador Allende. General Augusto Pinochet seizes power. In the midst of political repression and human rights abuses, an economic experiment is about to unfold that will reshape not just Chile, but eventually the entire global economy. A group of Chilean economists trained at the University of Chicago under the guidance of Milton Friedman, known as the Chicago Boys, are given free rein to radically transform Chile's economy. State-owned industries are privatized. Trade barriers fall. Price controls are lifted. Government spending is slashed. Chile becomes the world's first laboratory for a set of economic ideas that would soon be known by a simple yet contested term: neoliberalism. The Chilean experiment marked one of the first real-world applications of neoliberal policies, but the story begins decades earlier, in the aftermath of the Great Depression and World War II, when a small group of economists and philosophers began to question the growing consensus around government intervention in the economy. In April 1947, a gathering took place at the Mont Pelerin Hotel in Switzerland. Organized by Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek, this meeting brought together 39 scholars united by their concern about the future of classical liberalism and free market economics in a world increasingly dominated by central planning. Among the attendees were economists Milton Friedman, Ludwig von Mises, and philosophers Karl Popper and Michael Polanyi. Together, they formed the Mont Pelerin Society, which would become the intellectual cradle of neoliberalism. These thinkers were deeply alarmed by the rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe and what they saw as dangerous collectivist tendencies in Western democracies. Hayek had articulated these concerns in his influential 1944 book, The Road to Serfdom, where he argued that centralized economic planning inevitably leads to political tyranny. The guiding principle, Hayek wrote, that a policy of freedom for the individual is the only truly progressive policy remains as true today as it was in the 19th century. But what exactly is neoliberalism? The term itself has a complex history. Originally coined in the 1930s at the Walter Lippmann Colloquium in Paris, it was revived in the 1970s to describe the emerging economic orthodoxy that would come to dominate global policymaking for decades. At its core, neoliberalism represents a revival and modification of classical liberal economic principles. It emphasizes free markets, deregulation, privatization, free trade, and a reduced role for government in the economy. Neoliberals believe that market mechanisms, not government planning, are the most efficient way to allocate resources and generate prosperity. Milton Friedman, perhaps the most influential neoliberal economist, expressed this view succinctly. The government's solution to a problem is usually as bad as the problem and very often makes the problem worse. For nearly 3 decades after World War II, these ideas remained on the periphery of economic policy. The post-war consensus, heavily influenced by Keynesian economics, embraced significant government intervention to manage economic cycles and provide social welfare. This was the era of the New Deal in the United States and the creation of comprehensive welfare states across Western Europe. But by the 1970s, the Keynesian consensus was beginning to crack. A series of oil shocks triggered by OPEC's oil embargoes sent energy prices soaring. Inflation reached double digits in many countries. Unemployment rose simultaneously, creating a condition known as stagflation that Keynesian economics struggled to explain or address. The economic turmoil created an opening for neoliberal ideas. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom after campaigning on a platform of taming inflation and reducing the power of labor unions. "There is no alternative," she famously declared, referring to her free market reforms. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States with a similar agenda. Reagan's economic approach, soon dubbed Reaganomics, included significant tax cuts, deregulation of industries, and attempts to reduce government spending on social programs. Thatcher and Reagan forged a powerful political partnership that accelerated the global shift toward neoliberal policies. Under Thatcher, the UK government privatized major national industries including British Telecom, British Gas, and British Airways. She also engaged in a dramatic confrontation with the National Union of Mine Workers in 1984-85, ultimately breaking the power of one of Britain's strongest labor unions. Reagan similarly pursued deregulation across multiple sectors, from air travel to finance. His administration dramatically cut the top marginal tax rate from 70% to 28%. And when the air traffic controllers union PATCO went on strike in 1981, Reagan fired over 11,000 striking workers, sending a clear message about his administration's stance toward organized labor. The Reagan-Thatcher revolution extended beyond their own countries. International financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, heavily influenced by the United States and United Kingdom, began to require neoliberal reforms as conditions for loans to developing countries facing debt crises. This approach became known as the Washington Consensus. When Mexico faced a debt crisis in 1982, for example, it received IMF assistance only after agreeing to significant structural adjustments, privatizing state-owned enterprises, reducing trade barriers, and cutting government spending. Similar conditions were imposed on countries across Latin America, Africa, and later Eastern Europe after the fall of communism. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 seemed to provide the ultimate validation of neoliberal ideas. With centrally planned economies discredited, markets appeared to have triumphed decisively in the battle of economic systems. Political scientist Francis Fukuyama even proclaimed the end of history. The global triumph of liberal democracy and free market capitalism as the final form of human government. During the 1990s, neoliberalism reached its zenith. In the United States, Democratic President Bill Clinton declared that the era of big government is over and signed legislation deregulating the financial industry and reforming welfare. In the United Kingdom, Tony Blair's New Labour embraced many of Thatcher's economic reforms while seeking to soften their social impact. Around the world, countries rushed to privatize industries, open their economies to foreign investment, and reduce barriers to trade. The World Trade Organization, established in 1995, created new global rules promoting free trade. The European Union launched its Single Market Program, eliminating trade barriers between member states. Even countries with strong socialist traditions like India began liberalizing their economies. When India faced a balance of payments crisis in 1991, Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, later to become Prime Minister, introduced sweeping economic reforms that dismantled the license Raj, India's complex system of regulations and permits that had controlled private industry since independence. No power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come, Singh declared in his budget speech, quoting Victor Hugo. I suggest to this august House that the emergence of India as a major economic power in the world happens to be one such idea. But beneath the triumphalism, contradictions and tensions were emerging in the neoliberal model. In many countries, income inequality began to rise sharply. Financial deregulation led to increasingly frequent crises, from the Asian financial crisis of 1997 to the dot-com bubble of the early 2000s. In 1997, the economies of Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea, and other Asian nations that had been praised as models of development suddenly collapsed as foreign investors withdrew capital. The IMF responded with rescue packages that came with strict neoliberal conditions, including further opening markets and cutting government spending, policies that many economists later concluded had deepened the crisis. Joseph Stiglitz, former chief economist at the World Bank, became an outspoken critic of how neoliberal policies were being applied globally. The IMF's remedy, he wrote, is to impose austerity, but that just makes things worse. The global financial crisis of 2008 dealt an even more serious blow to neoliberal confidence. The crisis began in the U.S. housing market but quickly spread throughout the global financial system, triggering the most severe economic downturn since the Great Depression. Many observers noted that financial deregulation, a core neoliberal policy, had allowed banks and other financial institutions to take excessive risks with complex financial instruments like mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps. In the aftermath of the crisis, governments around the world intervened in markets on a massive scale. The U.S. government bailed out major banks and auto companies. Central banks slashed interest rates to near zero and purchased trillions of dollars in assets through programs like quantitative easing. These interventions seemed to contradict neoliberal principles, yet many economists argued they were necessary to prevent economic collapse. The crisis also sparked new social movements challenging neoliberal orthodoxy. The Occupy Wall Street movement, which began in 2011, focused attention on growing inequality with its slogan, "We are the 99%. Similar movements emerged across Europe, especially in countries like Greece and Spain, that were forced to implement harsh austerity measures as conditions for international bailouts during the European debt crisis. Political economists like Danny Roderick began to argue that globalization, a key component of the neoliberal project, was creating a trilemma, where countries could have at most two of the following three things: economic globalization, national sovereignty, and democracy. The backlash against neoliberal policies took an even more dramatic turn in 2016 with Britain's vote to leave the European Union and Donald Trump's election in the United States. Both campaigns tapped into frustrations with economic globalization and its perceived negative effects on workers in traditional industries. "The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer," Trump declared in his inaugural address, echoing sentiments that had helped fuel his victory. Even institutions that once championed neoliberal policies began to express doubts. In 2016, economists at the IMF published a paper titled Neoliberalism Oversold, which acknowledged that certain neoliberal policies had increased inequality and may have harmed long-term economic growth. The COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2020 further accelerated the retreat from neoliberal orthodoxy. Governments around the world implemented massive stimulus programs to support businesses and workers affected by lockdowns. The United States passed multiple trillion-dollar relief packages. Central banks expanded their interventions in financial markets. Many countries also recognized the vulnerabilities created by global supply chains optimized for efficiency rather than resilience. The concept of strategic autonomy in key industries like pharmaceuticals and semiconductors gained new prominence, challenging the neoliberal emphasis on comparative advantage and specialized production. Today, we find ourselves in what many scholars describe as a post-neoliberal moment. Not a complete rejection of markets, but a recognition of their limitations and the need for more active government involvement in addressing challenges like inequality, climate change, and public health crises. Political economist Mark Bleeth argues that we are seeing the end of the idea that the market is always right, that the state must shrink, that taxes are theft, and that a permanently globalized economy is both possible and desirable. Yet, as we reassess neoliberalism's legacy, it's important to acknowledge its complexity. Neoliberal policies contributed to unprecedented global economic growth and helped lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, particularly in countries like China and India that embraced aspects of market liberalization while maintaining significant state involvement in their economies. The story of neoliberalism is not simply one of triumph or failure, but a complex chapter in our ongoing effort to balance competing values: efficiency and equality, freedom and security, global integration and local autonomy. Historian Quinn Slobodian offers a nuanced view. Neoliberalism was never about freeing markets from states, but about finding the right legal and institutional structure to allow markets to function. As we look to the future, the challenge is not to swing blindly from one economic orthodoxy to another, but to learn from both the successes and failures of neoliberalism, to harness the dynamism of markets while ensuring they serve broad social goals and operate within ecological boundaries. The pendulum of economic thinking continues to swing. The pure market fundamentalism that characterized the height of the neoliberal era has given way to more pragmatic approaches that recognize both the power of markets and their limitations. As the economist Danny Roderick has argued, markets work best when they are embedded in strong institutions of governance. The neoliberal revolution that began in places like Chile under Pinochet and spread across the globe through the policies of leaders like Thatcher and Reagan has left an indelible mark on our world. Its emphasis on individual economic freedom and market mechanisms transformed economies and societies in ways both positive and problematic. Understanding this complex legacy is essential as we confront the economic challenges of the 21st century.
We've got some amazing content coming your way. Subscribe now so you're first in line for fresh insights and all the good stuff you won't want to miss.